Adjustments, adjustments, adjustments. Taking this old girl down to her constituent parts means all the alignments are reset, and we're going to have to tweak a bit to bring her back into full operation. The first step is to get the planer bed parallel to the cutter head. The cutter head position in this planer is immutable, so all of your adjustments need to be based on its position. To get started, I took a precision milled brass block that is exactly 1/2 inch square. I raised the planer bed up until the block just touched the cutter head on one side, and then checked the position of the other side. What you're looking for here is the high side. On my planer, the left side was higher than the right side by about 1/16 of an inch or so. You have a couple of different options to change the orientation of the table, but I chose to loosen the bevel gear from the high side and slide that gear out of the way. Doing so meant that I could rotate the elevation wheel without affecting the height of the bed on the high side. As you can see, I was now able to raise and lower the bed, but only have the bed height be affected on one side. I brought up the right side by about 1/16 of an inch and re-engaged the gear on the left side. I did another alignment check by bringing the bed up to the block again and checking the gap on the other side. In my case, I slightly overshot the adjustment and had to go back and make another slight change to the left side of the bed. Another check then showed I had exactly the same position from left to right. The visual gap between the bed and the bottom of the cutter head now looked perfect across both sides. I went ahead at this point and oiled the elevation shaft where it enters the base of the planer and at both sides of the bevel gears. The elevation shafts themselves also got a dab of oil. I went ahead and did a check to make sure that I could still move the bed through the full range of motion smoothly and without binding. The next step was to bring the infeed and outfeed rollers parallel with the bed and the cutter head by breaking loose the jam nuts. I was unable to move the adjustment nut without also threading the roll bearing stud out of the bearing housing because of the spring pressure that was being applied. To combat this, I used a small pry bar to gently raise the feed roller just enough that the alignment nut could be easily turned by hand. I moved one side of the roller up and down until it just touched the alignment block. Sliding the gauge over to the other side, it was too high, so I performed the same operation, raising and lowering the roller until it was even all the way across. Then, I adjusted it down evenly on both sides by turning the adjustment nut by about a half turn. You want that roller to sit just slightly lower than the cutter head. The alignment process is exactly the same for the outfeed side. Get the height correct on one side and make the other side match. Then, lower the outfeed roller just slightly on both sides by a little bit less than the infeed roller, maybe a quarter turn of the adjustment nut rather than a half. As with the infeed side, the gap now between the planar bed and the outfeed roller should appear even. I then reinstalled and tightened back down the jam nuts. I purchased a new set of planar knives. They're a little bit taller than the old knives that are being removed, so I won't need to use the height shims. The gibs have a flat side and one side with a small lip. There is also a groove that runs the entire length. When fitting the knives back into the planer, the gib's flat side faces away from the gib screws with the groove facing up, and the lip points toward the rear of the planer. The knives fit into the cutter heads with the gibs as shown. The bevel cut on the knives should be facing the front of the planer. I tapped the gibs flat into the bottom of the slot and left the knives sitting a little less than 1/8 of an inch proud. After I got the first knife fitted, I found that it wouldn't rotate all the way around without hitting the pressure bar, so I took a few minutes out and moved it down slightly so that it would clear the knives. Once I was sure that the cutter head would turn freely, I installed the other two knives in the same orientation as the first, making sure again that there was no interference through full cutter head rotation. I decided to try a faster technique for setting the knives that I had seen online, and then do some actual measurements afterward to see how accurate this method was. The way this works involves using two scraps of hardwood, I happen to have oak on hand, that were nearly identical in thickness. Mine were around 3/4 of an inch. The two strips are then positioned at either side of the bed and adjusted so that they just touch the knives. Then I loosened up the Gibbs screws on one knife and rotated the cutter head backwards gently, bumping it past the wood. The idea is that you should end up with both knives being set evenly across their width and to exactly the same height, assuming that your shims are the same height. After setting each knife in this way, I snugged up the individual Gibbs screws. Here you can kind of see the knife coming around and contacting the wood and pushing past it. And in doing so, the idea is that the knife will be pushed slightly up into the cutter head and therefore set evenly. Next, I needed a way to measure and check the height of each knife. So I cut a small scrap of maple into a shape that would fit over the radius of the cutter head and yet still span the knife. The block needs to be just tall enough to accommodate a dial indicator. Mine has a 3/8 inch shaft, so I drilled a mounting hole that was just slightly undersized. This provided a really solid friction fit for the indicator, and as you can see, allows a reading to be taken. To measure the knife height, you simply rotate the indicator up the knife bezel until you just get to the tip. If you go too far, the plunger will just drop into the slot. Just reset it back from the other side. Once I had the apex of the knife established on one end, I reset the dial to 0 to check the other positions along the knife. I made several measurements along the length of the knife and found that this bump method of installing left the knives out of alignment across the length by as much as 15 to 18 thousandths, and the alignment between separate knives was out by maybe 10 thousandths or so. For me, I decided that this error rate was too high, so I defaulted back to the tried and true, albeit slower way to get the knives set. I also found that the indicator holder that I had cut from 3/4 inch material was a little bit wobbly, so I made a new one out of some 8/4 maple that would provide better stability. Starting at one end, I determined the knife height and set the scale to 0. I would then move down the knife and check the position at the middle. If I was too low, I'd raise the blade slightly by using a small screwdriver at the bottom of the knife slot. If I was too high, I would gently tap the blade back down with a plastic-headed hammer. After setting the right side of this knife to 0, the middle was out by about 3 thousandths. So in this case, I just dropped it down by gently tapping on it. When I got down to the end of this knife, it also was high by about 2 thousandths. So again, I just tapped it down a little bit. After tapping it lightly, I rechecked and it was still off by about 2 thousandths, so I obviously didn't move it much at all. While adjusting this knife, it was low in the middle by about 10 thousandths. So in this particular case, I needed to raise the knife up, and again I did that using a small slotted screwdriver down at the end of the knife in its slot. Before I went to raise the knife up on the other side, I went ahead and tightened down the gib screw on the side that was correct by a little bit, so that hopefully it wouldn't move much as I shifted the knife position. After raising the knife, I found that I was now 10 thousandths too high, but that was a little bit simpler to adjust as it just required a couple of light taps. After just snugging up the gib screws a little bit on the middle of the knife, I moved back down to the end to recheck it and found that it was again a little bit high. So I went ahead and made those adjustments there. This was definitely an iterative process. Making a small adjustment, checking, tightening down a gib screw, checking the other side, making an adjustment, going back and checking what you just did, making another slight adjustment. It took a little while to get through all three knives. After an initial adjustment across the length of the knife, I would recheck the opposite side again and adjust as needed. Once I was satisfied with one side, I would lock the gib screw down gently on that one side and work back down the knife in the other direction to double check those measurements. When starting another knife, I'd usually try to raise it up a little higher than I needed because I found it was easier to tap the knife back down than it was to raise it back up. I was shooting for no more variance than 1 to 2 thousandths across the entire length of the knife, with a similar tolerance from one knife to the next. It was a little tedious, but I think this will provide the best possible positional accuracy. Once all the knives were set exactly where I thought they needed to be, I really tightened down all of the gib screws hard. You certainly don't want a knife coming loose while the cutter head is spinning. So after torquing down all of the screws, I went back and did just one more sanity check on all the knives, and fortunately found that they had not moved. Next up were the bed rollers. These should sit just barely above the table surface, just enough to lightly contact the workpiece as it's feeding. If you get them too high, the wood will tend to rock up and then down as it feeds through, and you'll get gouging from where the cutter head is cutting unevenly. Positioning the rollers is easy enough with the adjustment screws that are up under the bed. I used a straight piece of aluminum to see when the rollers came up high enough and locked the jam nuts after each adjustment. After they were all set, I then went back and lightly lubricated the bearings on both sides of each roller. I see this video is getting a bit long, but I really wanted to detail the adjustment process as much as was practical. I hope you'll join me for the next video.